I'm recording live from Blockchain's conference in Hamburg. Yeah, I'm sitting outside enjoying the sun because I couldn't find one silent spot within the conference space. As you can hear, the vibes are really great, like people are chatting and laughing around me. I wanted to introduce Jon Radoff, our guest for this week's podcast, and he is a game developer but also the CEO of Beamable. And we loved the conversation with him because we really dive into the development process of games, Jon's experience, the future of blockchain-based gaming, and AI tools to actually enhance the gaming experience and make it more personalized. So I hope you enjoy and leave us some feedback. Could you tell us about yourself, your background, what you're working on?
My background is in virtual worlds and games, and creativity are the domains that I've been involved in. I started as a kid playing Dungeons and Dragons and then making the digital equivalent of Dungeons and Dragons when I started making games, and then was an early builder of online games on the internet. Actually met my wife in an online game, and then we started a game studio together. So that's how I got my start. Along the way, I've created technology to build websites. I've worked on data analytics to understand how people use games in virtual worlds. I've also made games and shipped them to about 20 million users on mobile. So that's games like Star Trek Timelines and Game of Thrones Ascent. And these days I am working on Beamable, which is a technology platform for building virtual worlds and games and metaverse stuff.
How did you get started starting your own company, and especially with Beamable?
I mean, it started when I was a kid, really. I was making first games for bulletin board systems. So most people won't remember what a bulletin board system is now, but imagine like when you go to a message board or a forum on a website, there was a precursor to that where people built these message systems on standalone computer systems. The internet existed all along the way, but people weren't really using the internet in that way yet. So they were connecting with modems. So I made games, one was called Space Empire, another called Final Frontier. And I just fell in love with the creativity of it. So for me, entrepreneurship is really a creative journey. So it's about the creative aspects of the product that you make, but also the creativity around forming a business and the kind of organization you need and the way you're going to get those products to market. I think, building a company is just a vast creative canvas. So, that's kind of how I got my start. I've been involved in 5-ish companies along the way. Some of them have blended one from the next, like just, Beamable is, born out of the game studio that I was running called Disruptor Beam. And now it's, went from games with technology as sort of an enabler to now all we do is make the technology to help hundreds, if not thousands of other people make games. But, that my overall thesis for game development, which I think extends to a lot of things in life and technology companies and startups, is you just have to have a lot of shots on goal because you're going to make a ton of mistakes in any startup environment, and games especially are just super complicated. You can make a great game. It doesn't mean that game will be commercially successful. And I've experienced that myself. I've had games that I was really unsure whether they'd work, and then they were commercially successful. So there's a lot of weird factors that go into it, but the cases where I've been successful, it's really just because I gave myself a lot of chances. Like with the game I built, Star Trek Timelines. Star Trek is a very awesome but peculiar IP in that it's very difficult to make games that are true to the story of Star Trek. You can build a fighting simulator if you want and do the spaceship combat, but Star Trek isn't really about the spaceship combat part. It has it, but it's much broader. It's about, exploration and discovery and ethics and philosophy. It's got all these other things going on. So we just had to try a hell of a lot of things to try to capture that. So again, it's shots on goal. It's trying things. We failed, 4 or 5 times before we were successful with a design that ended up working. And had we shipped any of the earlier ones, I don't think we would have been successful. So that's the biggest lesson of my entrepreneurial journey. So what that needs is give yourself runway and give yourself efficiency through that process so that while you're making those mistakes, you've got the opportunity to try again and again.
Based on your learnings, like you can see that right now, I'm pretty sure you're know about all the type of games that are coming to the Web3 space, like based like a blockchain type of games. What are you think, like based on your like early time experiences and learnings, what are the mistakes that you see that these gaming maybe companies or even games are making, and how do you think that how they could be maybe avoided, or maybe there is no need to avoiding them, it's like a learning path?
Well, another general thesis I have for games is that you have to optimize around long-term engagement and building communities that will stand the test of time, which means you have to have game systems that really become virtual worlds for your players and allows them to live there over a period of time. So if I look back on the last couple of years of Web3 or blockchain gaming, the biggest problem has just been that a lot of flash in the pan projects came together where people were essentially trying to focus on the near-term monetization, meaning launch a bunch of NFTs and content, try to get people to sell it, try to create a market around it before people were even able to discover what the fundamental fun of these experiences would be. So I get why it happened. And in some ways, this approach to pre-funding game development isn't too different than what you'd see in Kickstarter, for example, where people have an idea and they pre-sell into it. So NFTs have been kind of a pre-sales funding mechanism for a lot of people. And it's appealing because you don't have to give up equity and all these other things that you would often do in building a game, and you don't have to do a rev share split with a publisher, which would be the other major option, the usual option within game development. So I get all of that, but I feel like the market kind of got caught in this cycle of, creating these launches, hyping it, and at the same time, very few of these teams, and frankly, team is kind of a generous word to use, because in a lot of cases they didn't have anybody who had ever made a game, or maybe it was like one QA person or one artist, but not a lot of depth. Like, games are really complicated beasts. They require a lot of expertise around a whole range of disciplines. And the hardest thing to do in gaming is shipping a product. So that's sort of my observation. Now, there are teams out there that I'm aware of that have a history of shipping product and really do know how to build games, and they're working hard at doing so. And it's going to take them some more time before they get out there. I think a lot of the better teams have pivoted away from the focus on the NFT launch and more towards, okay, we really got to focus on what the game experience is going to be. And out of some of those, there's bound to be some games that are really great. And then we'll see how it all plays out. But again, runway is good to have, but what you're doing with that runway, you got to take the shots on goal as well. And one shot, which is your NFT launch, without all of the other stuff you have to do around creative iteration and feature development and building the community that really loves not just sort of the objects of the world, but the verbs, what you do in the world. That's what's really important in games.
Let's imagine that the team that works on it is more experienced in doing the developing the games. What would be your view on the roadmap? Like, is it like pre-building some stuff before they go into the public and even building the community, and just rolling out it little by little and not starting it like with a NFT drop of PFP collections or whatever? What would be your suggestion as a roadmap?
Well, if we pull the camera lens back a little bit, let's talk about games generally speaking, and then we can talk about the Web3 games that you're interested in. I think one of the most important things, if not the most important thing in building a game, is to have a really strong understanding of the audience that you're going after. So when I built my first game, I understood the audience because I was in the audience. I was a deeply engaged player in text-based online role-playing games, what we called MUDs at the time. So I was deep into those communities. I knew exactly the kind of game that other players within that genre wanted to play, and I also knew how to build it. So that was what I brought to the table. The thing that I think people have focused on so far with Web3 games that have largely been in NFT launch without enough to follow on that is they think that their target audience is actually the NFT speculators that exist out there. And again, I get why that has happened. And at one point in time, there was just a lot of financial incentive to do that. But the speculator is not your customer. Speculation will happen in any game market with really compelling content that people want to collect and trade, just as it exists in Pokemon and just as it exists in Magic the Gathering as two examples, just as it exists in pretty much every collectible market, comic books, art, etc. But you don't make things for the speculator. You make it for the person who actually loves the world that you're building, the story, the narrative, the experience that they're going to be a part of by embracing that. And that's the audience to focus on, like really understanding like who's my player who's going to be around for a long time. I mean, games have an enormous potential to last a long time. Look at World of Warcraft. It's going into its 20th year this year. Like that's an example of a product with incredible staying power. And there are franchises even older than that, like when you get through the sequels and all that stuff. Like I think, Blizzard really, really understood the MMORPG market when they launched it, understood how to cross over to more of a mass market product. And that's what we need to see more of within blockchain games. So there's a lot of really interesting opportunities in blockchain games because between the composability, which is sort of what you were touching on when you were talking about one thing building into another, well, blockchain provides these really interesting capabilities around composability of art, of content, of code, of programmable value exchange, all of these things that allow you to create worlds that build on each other. You can create constellations of worlds and games that could interoperate with each other, sort of like what you have in a platform like Roblox, but now in a more decentralized fashion. So all of that is there, and I remain a believer that interoperability between worlds, so that you can form connections between them and connections between people who want to cooperate with each other without needing someone to be the platform that controls everything in and out. I think that that's something the world needs and wants, and it will arrive, but it's going to arrive in the course of sincere efforts to build great products. And great products mean that you understand an audience that you're going to entertain for many years, if not decades to come.
What people, like companies, should look at, especially if there is a young companies that we see right now in the space, to make sure that the product that they're building brings like a long-term value to their audience and then can turn into something that like the World of Warcraft.
Well, games have to do a few things really successfully. Games are fundamentally about, first, the fun you have in the moment. They're what you actually do and engage with that's fun at the very moment that you play it, what we call the core loop of the game experience. But games are also about aspiration, because what you're doing is you're teaching the player or communicating to the player what they're going to be able to do someday, right? So being able to also communicate through that experience what they can look forward to, so that you create this vision in their mind of what they could accomplish, whether that's the outcome of a story, winning a game, gaining mastery in something heavily skill-based. That aspiration is important. And then everything between that core loop and the aspiration is eventually about marking progress and taking them through that journey and communicating what the progress is and allowing them to encounter new experiences along the way that build you towards that aspiration. So when you're in the earliest stages of a game and you're building your community, you have to have ways of demonstrating that. So the narrative and the aspiration, you can communicate by explaining and showing being the key word, right? They're games. So you want to actually show people what you've been working on. You show people what they're going to be able to do when they achieve the most interesting aspects of the game experience, but also to make it real, it can't just be like these 3D rendered cutscenes with no actual gameplay substance behind them. You have to figure out, like, what is that core loop? What is the moment to moment experience that's going to be really fun? So you kind of have to figure out both as you go course of game development. And it's an iterative process. Once you ship your game, some of the decisions you've made through that process become very, very hard to change. While you're still in the earliest stages and you're talking to your community, you could still make changes there. Now, you might find that some of your community goes away, or some are new people come to it because now the shifts you've made attract a new community. That's interesting to observe and try to figure out. Like, that's kind of how we navigated our way through many iterations of our Star Trek game to figure out what was the right experience that was going to resonate with the audience, be a long-term game, and also be something that people would enjoy in the moment of play. But listen, these things are really hard. There's a reason why so many games fail. And it just comes back again to a combination of runway and trying a lot of things while you're still in the learning process.
I remember the conversation you had, I think, with Nicole
Lazaro.
Yes. And I remember that she presented this like model of different types of fun. And what I feel like I've seen in the past months and maybe past 2 years already, lots of easy fun, lots of fun that makes you engaged in the moment. What is your take on that?
Well, every game is a story in some respects, even games that we don't think of as having characters. Games, usually have a beginning, a middle, and an end, or at least a beginning and a middle that never ends is also a game design pattern. But the game of chess, for example, like, there is a certain mental model people tend to build around the game experience where the knights and the queen and the king are the characters, and you're fighting a battle, right? So the fact that you're playing at that level and thinking about it with those labels, even though it's a very loose structure, is different than another version of chess that could have been a purely mathematical abstraction, right? You could have had a piece called A that moves one forward, and another piece called B that can go unlimited vertical and horizontal length on the playfield, and you wouldn't think of it as a battle anymore. You'd think of it as almost a mathematical toy. So this is these kind of structures are a way you can think about most games. Like, what is the narrative that wraps around it? Now, in a game that's going to be deeply engaging for people, again, it comes to the aspiration, though. So people play chess for their whole life because they have an aspiration to master the game and get better and better at it and to level up. People play World of Warcraft for some similar reasons. Like, a lot of people do enjoy the aspect of, I want to master how good I am at beating a raid boss, is a big part of it. But also in that game, there are social aspects. There are aspects of just advancing your character and seeing your character develop over time. So games can have multiple aspirations that converge or work together within a game system. But figuring out what that story is and figuring out the story in the player's mind that's going to play out over the course of a long time, that's how you figure out aspiration. And then the mechanics of it is more like the things you do in the moment that make it fun. And you used the word fun a moment ago, and Nicole talked about her theory of fun. I have a article somewhere on my blog about 42 or 43 forms of fun or something like that. So the important thing to understand is there's a lot of ways you can have fun, right? I like cooking. That's fun to do. I like climbing mountains, at least, most of the time. Sometimes it's not fun in the moment. You look back and it's only fun to know that you achieved this really hard thing. It's what we call type 2 fun. So a lot of things are fun, but those aren't all games. Games have a structure. They're about making decisions. They're about navigating a story. They're about the moment to moment action that relates to an aspiration that's interesting to you as a player. So, games are kind of hard to define, frankly, but we can say that the class of things that exist that are games is a much smaller section of content than just things that are just generally fun that exist. And I think sometimes people make the mistake of, conflating that which is fun with a game, because a fun thing can be fun in the moment, but it's not going to keep you coming back. It isn't creating that story in your mind around aspiration where you want to master it over a long term or form social bonds or all these other things that contribute to long-term engagement.
But if we compare it to the metaverse, like from your point of view, or where maybe the metaverse or maybe the first iterations of the metaverse could be?
Well, first of all, I think of the metaverse a little differently than a lot of people. So there's these technology-centered definitions that are everything from what you were saying, like we're in the metaverse now because we're on Zoom and it's a real-time platform, or stuff like Roblox because it's a virtual world building platform, or Web3 stuff, which is primarily they're referring to the economic interoperability layer, or they're talking about AR or VR. So, I think all those are fine. Those are all ways that the metaverse exists, but it really comes down to digital identity. So metaverse is about the culture change that has happened over the last couple of decades as we've had an increasingly digital world in which our identities that we bring with us into that world are more important to us than ever. 20 years ago, there wasn't a whole lot of people doing esports. There was only there were a lot of people online, but not nearly as much as there is now. There weren't really social networks in the way that we have them now. Online games were still just getting started. So, at that time, there were some people that were experiencing as a metaverse. Like I met my wife in an online game. I feel like that happened in the metaverse. But where we are now is we have many hundreds of millions, if not billions of people who have digital identity so important to them, right? So when you think about framing everything as the importance of digital identity, then you understand why social networks and things like that and MMORPGs, online games and so forth are so important, and how technology will simply continue to push those things forward and dematerialize, digitize other experiences that we've got into this space. But when I think about identity, there's a few facets to it. So there's what I am in digital space. There's what I bring with me into digital space, like how I present myself within digital space, which is a form of self-expression. But beyond that, it becomes my creativity that I bring to virtual spaces as well. So it's my expression not only of, say, my avatar and who I am, but the shape of the worlds that I impact and create around me. So 20 years ago, you could make a website. That was a form of creativity, but it wasn't real time. It wasn't really digital identity at the core. It's a creative place where you could create transactional applications, information, and things like that. Now, we've got spaces that we interact with as people within virtual worlds, within metaverses, within games, and so forth. So the next step beyond that, and I consider it all to be metaverse already, but where metaverse goes from here is create more creative expression. So I believe there's a future where you're just going to speak entire worlds into existence. That's what I put in this recent deck that I called the direct from imagination era that we're going into, where really it's going to be less about programming and coding and assembling the pieces together. It's going to be more about composition, natural language, expressing yourself, and then entire simulations, virtual worlds, games will appear at your beck and call through that. And that's where the metaverse will be going from here.
I really like that you brought this digital identity concept. I think, I agree with you. There is like a different layers of like what it means for people. Like, people think about the avatars as one of the forms of their digital identities, something that represents the physical body of your. One of the layers is an avatar. Another layer is like how you present your avatar, I guess. And then there is like a different layers in terms of like what you stand for, what you're doing in the space, what are your maybe so-called profession within the metaverse, and how do you present it and stuff like that. What I am curious about is maybe a question about the interoperability of these identities, because I think the metaverse brings this opportunity for us to, when we create some kind of identity on the platform, we're not linking it to only this platform. What are your takes in terms of the interoperability and its challenges?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of technical challenges to interoperability because it's not just the way things look, it's also the behaviors that are associated with that. It's the different aesthetics that may exist within different environments. Within platforms like Roblox, of course, you have almost built-in interoperability because they've defined avatars to have a particular kind of structure, and you can acquire certain content in one world, take it with you into another, and it becomes persistent as you move around to different places. So it's easier to control it when you control all aspects of the platform and what will be permissible. I don't think there will necessarily be a global avatar system. I think there will be several forms of avatar system, and the creators and the worlds that want to cooperate with each other will have connections to each other. So it's not necessary. I don't really see a future where like you're going to take your World of Warcraft character into League of Legends, for example, like completely different game systems, different looks and all that. I think this is going to largely be the domain of new kinds of games, new startups, and game-like experiences that are not necessarily games in the sense we were talking about earlier. There'll be things like music and stuff like that, just like you've seen music in Roblox and Fortnite and whatnot, but you'll take an identity within these different applications and experiences with you. The thing that I want to point to, though, is not only will there probably be multiple avatar systems, each individual person will likely have different avatars in the way you want to express yourself in different cases. Like the way I'm going to express myself through like my personal brand on LinkedIn, for example, is different than I'm going to appear somewhere else. Just like on LinkedIn, I talk about content and vision and technologies and stuff. The stuff I'm posting on TikTok is like more creatively oriented, like here's cool stuff that you can do that you can just look at and see, and I appear differently there. It's going to be the same for all these different virtual worlds, and really that's a good thing, because the ability to take on different identities and self-expressions through the different places you exist, it's actually emancipatory. Like you can be anything you want to be within these worlds. We don't actually have the choice to be anything we want to be within our physical reality, because we're just constrained by a whole lot of things: social structures, biology, where we grew up, what culture we are in, what language we speak. In the metaverse, you'll be able to probably just have real-time translation technology in the future. Like everybody can just speak their own language and we'll understand each other. Like all of these things are coming, which are going to allow you to be a digital being in the context that you want to, and present yourself in the way that makes sense to you as you make meaning of the world around you and express and project that meaning for yourself back into the worlds that you interact in.
Okay, then maybe I have a question about the creator economy, because you were kind of mentioning that creating the content on different platforms, like a LinkedIn is like a one type of content that you create. Like TikTok is a different one, because like also like the audience is kind of different, and you also create the different types of personalities that people kind of identify you with. And I think the metaverse, and I think it had been before the Web3 space and the blockchain came into the play, creator economy already was very good developed when we think about even the platforms that we mentioned right now, or even if we talk about the gaming platforms, when like lots of software and engines are building the tools that allow people to create the content for this world without having like a specific like a coding skills, and like making it easier for everyone to create the code. But what is the difference that blockchain can bring to it, except that now you can apply maybe royalties, now you are the owner of the asset, well, and potentially if there is like a partnership between platforms, can be some kind of interoperability.
Well, the fundamental property of blockchain technologies, at least the ones that I think we're talking about here, which is ones with smart contract capabilities, is programmable value exchange. So you can create software applications that talk to each other and exchange value with each other without requiring an intermediary. And the thesis behind that is that as soon as you have an intermediary, that you then have someone who can extract rents, and you also get someone who you require the permission of to even participate in that. Like I'm reminded now, things fortunately have improved a lot, but when I first started doing online games, one of the things we needed was to get a credit card processing company to even let us do that, so we could charge people to play our games. And it's not unusual at all anymore. But let me tell you, when I first got started doing this, it was like I felt like I had to deal with like the criminal underworld version of banking that would even be like, I was dealing with like companies that dealt with porn companies and stuff like that, because I was an online game and they just didn't understand it. And my customer wasn't in my store buying something from me. So like I had to convince them that like it was all legit and it was going to be cool. People weren't going to be like, there wasn't anything untoward happening. We're just playing a game. And I had to find one that was willing to do that. I needed their permission, and I was lucky I found one, frankly, that would do it at all. Eventually, things got more mainstreamed. I went to kind of more of a standard credit card processing, but that's what happens when you give some kind of entity the power to decide whether you can be in business and how much of your business you're going to have to exchange to them for that gift that they're giving you. So blockchain makes it possible to build new kinds of applications and software, which doesn't place that intermediary in the beginning. Now, there's advantages beyond just the pure decentralization of that, which is now, because you don't have to trust anybody, it allows applications to interoperate with each other who wouldn't normally trust each other or want to cooperate to begin with. So you could have, say, two large game publishers that exist within the same world, and they have exchanges. World isn't quite the word I'm looking for there, but the same platform where you can have exchanges of value between the participants. Maybe they wouldn't otherwise do that, right? So it ought to unlock a lot of creativity and spawn a whole new set of applications with smaller teams who don't need to invest as much resource into all of these other payment platforms, for example, but also opening up what you were just referring to, creator economies, where people can make pieces, lean into the composability of these technologies, meaning that you can create content entities and assets, snippets of code, all of these different things that you want to share with people, and allow yourself to exchange value from that component with other places that it will be.
I was curious, like, how will from your perspective, it will change the, not only from the gaming perspective, but in general, like education, work, and like even having like a new professions and changing the whole market system, like what people do. Like, how do you think it will impact the general industries within specific areas, and whether it's going to be like, from your perspective, of course it's just the predictions, but understanding like whether it's going to be something like, separate, like let's say people creating content, or it's going to replace some of the things from the world that we have now.
Well, all of these technologies are going to allow people wherever they are in the world to create things and share it with other people. So games is the obvious application because it's what people already do online. Social networks and new forms of social network is another thing people are already doing. So those are kind of the obvious things. But you mentioned education. Like, I think that that's going to be one of the most transformed sectors in the future, because think about how hard education is most of the time. You have these physical locations, people go into a school, each individual person is treated exactly the same. And then you get outcomes based on that, which is a consequence of maybe you don't have access to the best instructors in the world because they're not going to travel to your location. Maybe it's not a educational program which is best for all of the individual participants in it, because that's not the way that they're going to learn or even what they're interested in. So with the metaverse, we have people able to bring together the instructors who are good for a certain kind of learner, connect them together, and then using the technologies that are emerging, that instructor can craft content and experiences just for that person. So you can see the proto version of this in things like Khan Academy, for example. Like if you want to learn calculus, for example, or a lot of math, everything from, elementary school math up to like multivariable calculus, it's hard to imagine there being a better place you could go than Khan Academy, because he's such a good instructor and he explains things so well, and the exercises are really good. And it's even got a little bit of so-called gamification around it to motivate you as you learn and track your progress. So, that's the proto version though. Like it wasn't easy to make Khan Academy. Like Sal Khan, I think, had to do a lot, not just recording the videos, but all the structure that goes around it. Well, in the metaverse, we're going to have a few interesting advantages. One is, first of all, a lot of types of learning take advantage of the fact that it's got to be based spatially, right? So I spoke to a group from the International Space University recently, for example. So you don't really understand the scale, for example, of a satellite or a spacecraft or anything until you actually see it in virtual space, or real space, if you're lucky enough to go there in person. So that experience of seeing these objects and understand how they work mechanically, physically, how you engineer them, it's a much better learning experience for you when you experience it, at least on your screen, if not in like a 3D VR kind of experience. So you got that advantage of just delivering content and information immersively, which for many subjects, training, I want to repair my washing machine, like it's a lot better to see that in 3D than it is just reading a manual. But the other aspect is then how you create those things, coming back to what we were referring to earlier, which is we're going towards a future where through natural language and generative AI and 3D immersive spaces, what we'll be doing is speaking these things into existence. So if you're a teacher and you want to explain things, you'll be able to prepare materials in advance that reflect that, but you'll even be able to do it in real time. You get asked a question by a student, you'll be able to explain and shape the virtual reality. And I mean that broadly. It doesn't have to be like wearing a headset. It could just be on a screen. You'll be able to shape that content around you and bring people into it so that they can actually experience it. So I think education is a tremendous example. I think, music, movies, all forms of media that we experience, all of that is going to be completely transformed by these technologies, because the creative process is going to make it much more accessible to people. It's going to democratize a lot of these technologies. And then the interactivity that you get through things like real-time performance, real-time creativity, that in itself is going to bring about whole new experiences. That said, it's going to start with games. Games is what we have. It'll probably go to other forms of media first. Music is a very promising category. And from there, it's going to transform all aspects of our society. The blockchain aspect, to the extent that some of these things are going to have assets and content and components that have a lot of utility by bringing them from one experience to another. So if you're that educator who makes some content that could be shared across different virtual worlds, or if you're a fashion designer who's creating a costume for an avatar that people want to be able to have, these are things that have interesting use cases for interoperability, because we already know that exists, right? You can go to Roblox and it's not as open as the metaverse we're talking about, but you have those exact use cases present right now, and people pay for it, and the economy exists within a relatively closed environment. So next, as we open it up to the world, you're going to have even more use cases and a bigger long tail of the content creation that's available.
I was actually going to ask you before about the creator economy and artificial intelligence, and what you think we'll be able to create just using our voice. actually was going to make a reference as well to your, I think, recent blog post about creating a text-based game just from ChatGPT. So that was already quite impressive.
My question will be maybe about the timing. Like, what is your prediction about the timing? Like when we will be able to creating assets together with the AI and like 3D assets, and then making it functional within the world?
Faster than anyone expects is the answer, because there's so much brain power going into building all of these different generative technologies right now. 3D is a harder problem to solve than 2D. 2D art itself is a really hard problem to solve, but we can see, like, just compare 1 year ago, stuff like Disco Diffusion on Collab notebooks and the stuff you could create then, which was pretty amazing actually, but it didn't really have the feel of stuff that you could actually use. And compare that to some of the stuff you get out of Midjourney or Stable Diffusion now, like it's in some cases immediately usable. Like I use Midjourney all the time to make images that I put right into slide decks as supplemental art and things like that. So you can actually use these things now. So 3D has a lot of more complexity to it because there's a lot more steps. You have to go from maybe that concept art, which you could get out of something like a Midjourney, to a 3D model, or you text prompt the 3D model into existence, and the model has to be texture mapped. If it's going to be animated, you have to be able to rig it, meaning giving it like a skeleton that moves around. The animation itself of how things move has to be associated with that rigging. You have to create texture maps. You have to do a UV unwrap. You have to then place that in an environment. You have to light it. So all of this has incredible complexity to actually deliver a experience or a finished product. So we'll continue to see like demoware for a little bit that attacks different pieces of this. Like you'll see some stuff that makes a cool 3D model. You'll see other stuff. I've seen stuff that does automated rigging, for example, of 3D models. To really deliver the result, we have to compose all of this into a pipeline that just kind of does everything for you. I think natural language is going to be the interface for a lot of the changes that we make moment to moment. And then there will be a set of tools that are used by experts and specialists to go down into the weeds and fiddle with details, more of like a sculpting experience than a build from the ground up experience. But all that stuff's coming. 3D content, and then you could go to the next level, which is like how you compose all these 3D components into complete worlds. Could we render an entire world? And there's even companies working on that. So it's going to be an exciting next few years for sure. When does it come? A year ago, I predicted that one person would be able to make something like an Elden Ring by themselves in a decade, which was a little bit of a sandbag because I thought it could happen sooner than a decade, but I didn't know how much sooner. After the last year, like it sure seems like that's going to come a hell of a lot faster than a decade. Like now it feels like in the next few years, you could see that capability.
If you had one superpower, which one would that be?
Oh boy, one superpower, what would that be? That's funny. I've been asked this kind of question before, and I'm not sure. I wouldn't want to know the future because the fun of existence is navigating reality in the present. I guess that I know it'll sound kind of weird, but I spend time meditating, and I feel like I don't spend enough time in the present. So if I had a superpower, it would be able to just sort of push a button and be completely locked into the present for as long as I want to, because I think that's the power that we as humans actually have to affect reality around us and also to come away with the experiences that matter.
I love that answer. And unexpected, most of the people go to them some superpowers of flying and stuff, but it's a really good and really useful and valuable. Thanks for the conversation. And yeah, thanks again.
Okay. Thank you so much.